Hi, I'm Jeanette Roche. This is Bridge City News. Here are some of the top stories we've been following. The writ drops in Alberta, signaling the start of the official election. Plus, the Canadian government strikes a deal with the majority of the striking federal workers. And healthcare laborers hold an information picket at the Lethbridge Provincial Building. We tell you why.
Your nation. Your province. Your southern Alberta. From the heart of Lethbridge, it's Bridge City News with Jeanette Roche.
Thanks for joining us. Starting today, if you're in Alberta, you'll begin to see election signs go up on private property, as well as ramped up door-knocking efforts to get your vote. The writ has been dropped officially, signaling the start of the 2023 Alberta provincial election, which will be held on May the 29th. For weeks now, both Smith's United Conservatives and Rachel Notley's New Democrats have been unofficially campaigning. Both leaders appeared at rallies over the weekend. This morning, Danielle Smith appeared in Calgary to introduce a new permanent tax cut if her party is elected.
So today, I'm pleased to announce a re-elected United Conservative government will create a new 8% tax bracket on income under $60,000. This means that every Albertan earning over $60,000 or more will save $760. That is $1,500 per family. Albertans earning less than $60,000 will see a 20% reduction to their provincial tax bill under this tax cut. This permanent billion-dollar tax cut will provide meaningful, timely tax relief to Albertans at a time when they need it most.
Smith also announced that an elected UCP government would extend the fuel tax holiday until December of 2023, ensuring a savings of 13 cents at the pump, or roughly $10 every time we fill up our vehicle. In the last few months since becoming premier, Smith has spent $2.5 billion in inflation relief measures, $330 million on the Calgary Arena deal, and now a $1 billion tax cut. NDP leader Rachel Notley officially launched her campaign today. Notley's NDP says the UCP's backdoor measures, including hiking user fees and de-indexing personal income tax rates, have led to higher costs for families. Taking questions from the media today in Calgary, Notley discussed a wide range of issues, including her handling of the economy when she was premier.
What I've always said to many folks is that what we needed to do on a whole range of issues, including growing our economy, engaging with job creators and entrepreneurs throughout Calgary as well as throughout the province, is that we needed to be able to listen more and to engage more up front. And the commitment that we have going forward is that is exactly what they can count on from us.
Notley adds that she remains committed to putting the priorities of Albertans first. Polls suggest the battleground for a vote is clearly defined, with UCP supporters generally focused on the economy and money issues, and NDP supporters focused on health, education, and social programs. But political science professor Lori Williams disagrees, saying all Albertans are concerned with all of these issues, particularly healthcare. To break it all down, I'm going to bring in Lori Williams from Mount Royal University. She joins me from Calgary. Lori, welcome, and thank you so much for joining me. A big day in Alberta. We've got both Notley and Smith ramping up their efforts, specifically in battleground Calgary and a few areas around Edmonton. So is this where we're likely to see a lot of that door knocking and campaigning as the two vie to be the next premier?
Yeah, I think for sure on the door knocking, the ground game, as we sometimes call it, the door knocking, try to reach out to voters, answer the questions they have, try to reassure them that you've got the answers to their questions or the best answers to their questions, and then try to get them out to actually vote, which may turn out to be a bit of a challenge in this particular election. And the reason for that is that for the moderate voters, those centrist voters, or even conservative voters that are moderate conservative voters, there's a bit of a gap between where they are and where the UCP, some of the candidates, and certainly the leader are on a number of issues. And so I think those folks at the doors can answer a lot of questions for folks and help them to understand
And both are making a ton of promises right now, as well as attacking the other party, which is pretty typical. But how do you think all of this will fare for either of them right now in these battleground areas? Smith made the announcement this morning for that $1 billion tax cut, as well as extending the fuel tax holiday. So will any of this make a difference for her?
I think a lot will depend, especially for those voters who are still undecided, who don't really see a home in either of the parties for them right now. Some of the answers to the questions they have might give them the reassurance that they need. But there are a lot of areas in the province where there are a lot of questions around healthcare, and Danielle Smith has appointed 3 panels on healthcare that aren't going to be reporting to her until after the election. So I'm expecting there to be lots of questions about what she actually stands for. And I think there'll be a lot of questions about where both parties, both leaders stand, what their promises are, what it's going to cost in the final analysis, because they're not just talking about what they're going to spend, but they're also talking about reducing taxes, for example. Then what's that going to mean for folks that are struggling with affordability right now?
Lori, thanks so much for spending time with us today.
It was great chatting with you. Have a good one.
Thank you. You as well. Lori Williams is a professor in the Political Science Department at Mount Royal University and joined me today from Calgary. Well, members of Alberta unions of provincial employees rallied across Alberta on Monday afternoon, protesting short staffing in healthcare facilities and deteriorating working conditions. There were also workers protesting at the Lethbridge Provincial Building during May Day, which is also known as International Workers' Day. Darren Graham, the AUPE vice president for the South Region, says the group recently polled an estimated 4,000 to 5,000 members on the topic of working short.
They all reported back issues around staffing at their facilities, the lack of employer empathy, and increased workloads complexity, which I was talking about with over at the courthouse, for example. We've had a real change there in the complexity of work as well as we're losing people to health issues, retirements, and they're not being replaced. We're seeing the same issue in registries where we're losing long-term staff. And they're trying to do like these hirings of casuals for 12 months, or what they call wage staff for 12 months. As those staff don't see, any future in that job, because they don't seem to be wanting to hire permanent people, they resign partway through, or don't complete the training, or they apply for a different job that actually is full-time.
Graham told us that the survey also mentioned 40% of members polled reported working without breaks, and 25% of them said they worked through their lunches. After almost 2 weeks on the picket lines, more than 120,000 federal government workers were back on the job this morning. The Public Service Alliance of Canada reached a tentative 4-year contract agreement with the Treasury Board overnight that will give workers a 12.6% raise and a $2,500 one-time lump sum payment. But PSAC is still trying to negotiate a new contract for 35,000 Canada Revenue Agency workers who are still walking those picket lines. PSAC says it's entered into a blitz of negotiation. The CRA, by the way, has not extended that tax filing deadline. Regardless of workers reaching a deal or not, the deadline for filing your taxes was May the 1st. Treasury Board President Mona Fortier held a press conference after the federal government reached a tentative contract agreement with the country's largest federal public sector union, ending that 12-day strike. Fortier says the deal, which affects more than 120,000 public servants, is fair and competitive.
This is excellent news for employees and for Canadians. This wasn't easy. We negotiated, we compromised, and we found creative solutions. And after many long days, nights, and weekends of hard work, we've reached fair and competitive deal for employees. And with wage increases of 11.5% over 4 years that are in line with the recommendations of the Public Interest Commission, these are also reasonable deals for taxpayers.
A Ukrainian Lethbridge resident is now the proud recipient of the ASET CEO Award, otherwise known as the Association of Science and Engineering Technology Professionals of Alberta. Mila Wagner, a civil engineering technology professional, moved from Kyiv, Ukraine, to Alberta 2 years after Russia's invasion of Crimea in 2014. Video journalist Micah Quinn met up with Wagner to talk about the award and her long journey from Ukraine to Lethbridge.
It feels great when highly prestigious organization like ASAT recognizes your hard work and gives you an opportunity to prove your value to the world.
Last year, Wagner devoted a good chunk of her time to promoting several initiatives from ASAT, which support engineering technology professionals who are newcomers and refugees from Ukraine, as well as other countries. Barry Kavanagh, the CEO of ASAT, says Wagner was very deserving of the award.
She was an interesting story for us because she found out after the fact, after she had come here and enrolled in Lethbridge College, that she probably would have been qualified to sit our competencies-based assessment and our certification exam, and probably would have been qualified to get a designation as a CET initially, but she hadn't heard about it. And that was a really interesting thing that we wanted to make sure that through her efforts, we could help people like her who came to the province become aware of the fact that there is a level playing field.
Wagner is now married and is working for an engineering consulting firm in Lethbridge while raising her son, Nikita. She mentioned she has also provided a haven for other relatives and friends who are fleeing the war-torn country of Ukraine and coming to Alberta as the conflict against Russia rages on. Earlier in April, Wagner took the oath of Canadian citizenship with her son at a ceremony in Calgary. Wagner told us her parents are still in Ukraine, and it's been incredibly hard knowing that they are in constant danger due to the war. Last year in June, there was a missile attack at a shopping mall in Kremenchuk, Ukraine, right where her parents live.
I want so much to move them to Canada as soon as possible, and I keep my hopes up so I would be able to do so.
For Bridge City News, I'm Micah Quinn.
Recyclosaurus Rex, Dumpenstein, and the Bincredible Hulk. Well, who are these strange characters? Well, they happen to be the new names for Lethbridge's trash, recycling, and organics collection trucks. The names were created by a group of elementary school students from Lethbridge School Division and Holy Spirit Catholic School Division. A contest through the city gave students the opportunity to name the trucks through entries. Well, over 500 entries were sent into the city, and with one of the winning names being the Bincredible Hulk.
Anytime that we have an opportunity to connect with the community, whether it's the adult members of our community or some of the kids of the community, we always take an opportunity to do that. And so naming the trucks really connects people with the trucks that are going through their community on a weekly basis, collecting garbage, recycling, and organics. So again, something that maybe seems a little abstract to the community, it really brings it home and shows them exactly what they're doing and how they're trying to do it.
If residents would like to see the location of the named trucks, they can use the online tracking tool. Lethbridge Fire and Emergency Services had a busy weekend responding to several incidents. On Sunday at 1:45 p.m., fire crews responded to a vehicle fire on the north side. The fire was extinguished quickly with no extension to any surrounding buildings. Then at 3:30 p.m. that same day, fire and EMS crews responded to an incident where a car had collided with the Service Sports Center, causing moderate damage to the building. And an hour later at 4:30 p.m., fire crews, including hazmat technicians, responded to a small fuel leak from a pickup truck on the south side. Crews were able to mitigate the situation with minimal involvement to the environment. No injuries were reported in any of the incidents. Police in Edmonton say they're investigating social media reports of stabbing, finger biting, and barricade rushing involving fans during the Oilers' victory over the Los Angeles Kings on Saturday. Police Chief Dale McPhee says there will be more officers in downtown Edmonton to respond to any possible violence by unruly fans. McPhee says although there has been a rise in violence around the arena, most fans are there to respectfully enjoy the game and cheer on their team. Now, keeping with our attention on the NHL playoffs, John Tavares scored in overtime as Toronto beat Tampa 2-1 in Game 6 to take the team's first-round series 4-2. The victory marked the first time in nearly 2 decades that the Leafs have made the second round of the NHL playoffs. Calgary's head coach Daryl Sutter was fired by the Flames on Monday after the team missed the Stanley Cup playoffs for the second time in 3 seasons, finishing 2 points behind the Winnipeg Jets for the second wild card from the Western Conference. Over to the war in Sudan, which was sparked over 2 generals in a power struggle. Despite a ceasefire, airstrikes continue to rock the capital city of Khartoum, according to our foreign affairs expert Lisa Daftari. This has left Western nations scrambling to evacuate their citizens.
It's very difficult to see how there will be a resolution in sight, some sort of a compromise of sorts, splitting the country in half. I mean, what will it take for these 2 men to back down? And ironically, these 2 men were supposed to integrate in the aftermath of political turmoil that we recently had in Sudan. They were supposed to integrate their armies to protect the country. And of course, when money gets in the way, greed gets in the way, there are gold mines in the country. When they wanted to get into the gold mines, they started fighting and wanting to have, again, possession of these, more favorable areas.
Catch that full interview with Lisa Daftari in the second half of our show. More avalanches hit Banff's National Park this weekend, this time at the popular Sunshine Village Ski Resort. The Class 2 slide happened just before 1 p.m. Saturday on Goat's Eye Mountain on a run called Mother-in-Law. Rescue crews from Sunshine and Parks Canada attended the scene to ensure that no one was caught in the slide. The high avalanche activity is being caused by the unseasonably warm weather in the Rockies. And speaking of unseasonably warm, we reached a daytime high of 25 degrees here in Lethbridge and could hit close to 30 degrees later this week. I'll be back after the break with a full national weather report. And welcome back. Some beautiful days expected in the coming week here, getting close to 30 degrees. So we're looking at 21 degrees, beautiful Saturday, lots of sunshine on Sunday as well for a high of 23 degrees. So it's gonna be a lovely weekend out there. And then look what happens as we get back into the work week. Monday, high of 26 degrees, up to 25 on Tuesday, all the way up to 30 on Wednesday. Will that be a record breaker? We'll have to see. And then 29 degrees on Thursday as we round out that 7-day forecast. Of the average high for this time of year, 15 degrees. We're well above that though. 1 is the low average for this time of year. 31 was our high temperature on this day back in 1939. And in 2005, we were sitting at a chilly -10. That's very cold for the end of April. Okay, so sun rose this morning at 6:14, sunset this evening at 8:44 p.m. We're so close to 15 hours of daylight now. I'm loving it. On the west coast, very sunny. Victoria looking at 21 degrees, a 30k wind in the Juan de Fuca Strait. 21 as well in Vancouver, but guess what? Looking at 25 degrees as you move closer inland. Lots of sunshine there as well. Edmonton sitting at 18 degrees with a mix of sun and cloud, and a high of 21 degrees in Calgary tomorrow with winds at 20 to 40 kilometers per hour. Looking to the rest of the prairies now, mainly sunny skies across much of Saskatchewan. Saskatoon sitting at 15 for a high, 13 for a high in Regina. Winnipeg could see some scattered showers with a high of 11 degrees. Okay, let's take a look at what's going on in the central part of the country. Toronto also seeing some periods of rain, 11 degrees for a high. Actually looking at 5 millimeters there, more like 5 to 10 millimeters of rain in Ottawa, so quite a bit of rain expected there. 13 for a high. And then there we go, scattered showers in Montreal tomorrow with a high of 15 degrees. As we move out further into the East Coast, lots of sunshine expected as well. 16 for a high in Fredericton. 15 is the expected high tomorrow in Halifax. Charlottetown looking at a high of 11 degrees and 2 degrees only in St. John's, Newfoundland. Also looking at 60% chance of flurries and fairly windy conditions as well. So there you have it. That is your forecast.
Today's weather report is brought to you by Ridge Utilities, providing competitive rates for electricity, natural gas, and internet, while investing back in communities across southern Alberta.
Statistics Canada's latest report on economic growth shows the country's economy grew by just 0.1% in February. It's a figure that was lower than expected by the federal agency as wholesale, retail, trade, and manufacturing all contracted. StatsCan's preliminary estimate suggests real gross domestic product in the first quarter grew at an annualized rate of 2.5%. The Canadian economy is expected to stall this year and potentially enter a recession as high interest rates weigh on consumers and businesses. Canadian convenience store chain Couche-Tard has signed a deal to buy more than 100 gas stations in the U.S. from Mapco Express Incorporated. Couche-Tard says the 112 sites are mostly in Tennessee, Alabama, with some in Kentucky and Georgia. The deal is contingent on a separate transaction that will see Mapco and its other locations acquired by Majors Management LLC. Financial terms of the deal were not immediately available. Now here's a look at today's markets.
The TSX was up 113 points on the day to finish at 20,636. The Dow was up 272 points to 34,098. The S&P 500 was up 34 to 4169, and the Nasdaq was up 84 points to 12,226. West Texas Intermediate Oil was up 202 to 76.78 US per barrel. Natural gas was up 6 cents to 2.41 US. Gold was up 2.21 to 19.89.99 US an ounce, and silver was up 13 cents to 25.05 US an ounce. Feed wheat is at 11.16 per bushel, barley is at 8.97, canola is at 15.72, and corn is at $10.14 per bushel. Live cattle were down 28 cents to 175.18. Feeder cattle were down 55 cents to 210.98. Lean hogs May contract were up $1.53 to 79.65, and the Canadian dollar was up slightly over the past 24 hours to 73.79 US.
Recapping one of our top stories, as 155,000 federal workers remained on strike for a 10th day in a row Friday, the federal government says it presented a counteroffer to the Public Service Alliance of Canada. It's the first sign of any progress since the union said things were at a stalemate on Wednesday. The Public Service Alliance of Canada confirmed receiving the offer and says it hopes to continue bargaining throughout the weekend. The subject of COVID-19 vaccine injuries is a controversial topic. Claims of vaccine injuries are often dismissed if there were pre-existing conditions prior to receiving a dose. Charissa Clam, a former healthcare worker, says after receiving her second jab, she endured a long battle due to a confirmed vaccine injury. Catch her story after the break in a full interview with BCN's Naveen Day. Also, if you see news happening in your community, be sure and drop us an email at info@bridgecitynews.ca. We'd love to hear from you. The California School District approves a new curriculum accusing Israel of ethnic cleansing. Plus, people continue to flee war-torn Sudan despite an extended ceasefire, and the Biden administration issues sanction on Iran and Russia. To discuss all of this and more is our foreign affairs correspondent, Lisa Daftari of the Foreign Desk, who joins us from Los Angeles. Lisa, welcome. Great to have you on once again.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
So, Lisa, despite the extension of a ceasefire, heavy fighting does continue to rage on in Sudan with rocket attacks in the country's capital city of Khartoum. So it seems that this is over a conflict involving two generals.
Basically a conflict over egos. It's very difficult to see how there will be a resolution in sight, some sort of a compromise of sorts, splitting the country in half. I mean, what will it take for these two men to back down? And ironically, these two men were supposed to integrate in the aftermath of political turmoil that we recently had in Sudan. They were supposed to integrate their armies to protect the country. And of course, when money gets in the way, greed gets in the way. There are gold mines in the country. When they wanted to get into the gold mines, they started fighting and wanting to have, again, possession of these, more favorable areas. So a lot going on, a lot of nuances going on. But of course, the people will pay the consequences, the death toll rising there, the ceasefire is not sticking. And we're glad that the Western nations have been able to start their evacuations. The United States was lagging a bit. The European nations got their people out. The United States started last weekend with personnel from the embassy. And after much backlash, a lot of criticism, they began with the civilian evacuations as well. Now we're getting U.S. citizens out as well. So, of course, the the entire international community looking and hoping that this ceasefire will work, that they come to their senses, and that the people are out of harm's way.
What is the U.S. plan for evacuating its citizens? You were saying that they're lagging a little bit there.
Right. So originally they took out their embassy personnel, and the order, according to the State Department, was to shelter in place. They told us, and the foreign desk reached out to the State Department, they told us that they thought that that was the best course of action because it was too dangerous to get people out right now. The estimated number of U.S. citizens was 16 to 18,000 there. And of course, John Kirby said to the media that, well, perhaps some of those people don't want to get out, and some of them may be U.S. citizens who are living there. They're Sudanese nationals, and they want to stay there. But of course, again, the criticism being, well, how about the people who do want to get out and they want to get out to safety? So of course, there was a lot of criticism and a lot of attention on the State Department over the last week, and they began evacuations at the over the weekend, and we're waiting to see how that goes. But again, Germany, France, the UK were able to get their nationals out. We reported on that. And now, again, U.S. following suit.
I'm having flashbacks of Afghanistan from last year, all of a sudden, with all the evacuation. So, yeah, Lisa, the Biden administration has issued sanctions on Iran and Russia. So will these sanctions help Americans being held abroad to come home?
Right, and that's the goal. You know, it's interesting because you see a lot of these rogue nations standing up to the United States and really trying to stick it to us when it comes to foreign policy and when it comes to carrying out their own agendas. So in the case of Russia, you have them invading Ukraine right now. You have them evading the U.S. sanctions that are already in place. You have them trading with unlikely partners like Iran's regime, or like North Korea, like China. So the rogue players on the map have found each other and have found ways to evade the United States and their economic punishments together. And again, Iran and Russia being at the top of that list. Now, these two nations also are holding Americans hostage. And when it comes to negotiating with terrorists or rogue partners, the United States doesn't want to give in, but many times they have to. And there is some sort of, prisoner swap, and it's always lopsided. We just had Victor Bout in exchange for Brittany Griner, the WNBA player here in the United States. We brought her back home. Of course, there are other American citizen, Paul Whelan, still in Russia, and in Iran. We have many U.S. Nationals being held there, and we've been asking for them to be released for many years. And of course, the Iran regime continues with its rogue behavior, both inside the country and outside. And now we have a new set of sanctions by the Biden administration. But Jeanette, the bottom line is Iran's regime, Russia's government, they know what the Biden administration is all about. We're working in circles here. In one breath, the Biden administration is working to loosen money and funds to Iran's regime through Iraq. And on the other hand, trying to punish them with sanctions, or at least the announcement of sanctions from the podium. Who knows if they'll be enforced? Who knows if they'll be taken seriously? And that's the bottom line here. If our adversaries don't take us seriously, then these sanctions, they're just lip service from the podium. So we'll have to see if we can bring those hostages back home and what it will take, but it's not going to be lip service from the podium. It's going to take much more enforcement than that.
Lisa, can you maybe tell us the importance of the U.S. presence in Iraq? Is it effective in hampering Iran and Islamic terrorism?
Yeah, well, the United States being in the Middle East, having some sort of foothold in the Middle East has had a ripple effect in terms of Iran's regime being able to carry out many of its goals. Mainly for 44 years since Iran's regime has been in power, its goal has been to spread its brand of Islam, which is Shiite Islam, in a form of political Islam throughout the country. So govern throughout the region, rather. So throughout the region, they've wanted to spread their brand, their hegemony. They've wanted to just grow in terms of their influence, and U.S. influence in these places has definitely helped in curbing that growth, that influence. It's also helped in protecting Israel, our ally in the region. Of course, they have superior intelligence to the United States in terms of watching over Iran's growth and the way that it is spreading its influence in places like Syria and Iraq. But of course, again, the United States having some sort of foothold there. And that's what we said. That was the criticism when we said that the U.S. pulled out of Afghanistan. For 20 years, the U.S. was there. They had some sort of presence there. And of course, we don't want these troops there indefinitely. Of course not. But we hope that we do get some sort of results from sending our treasure over to the region and leaving with some sort of stability or security in place before we do pull out. So that's what we're hoping for Iraq as well. We know Iran's regime is hovering over, hoping to have full control and access to the region. And of course, countries like Lebanon, Iraq, Syria, Yemen, and the list goes on. They do have their footprints there and their influence there as well.
Absolutely. Now, Lisa, over the weekend, footage was aired on Iranian TV showing Iranian commandos seizing a tanker that was bound for the U.S. So what was on the ship that Iran was after?
Yeah, it's amazing what the Iran's regime has been able to do since Biden has been in office in terms of its chest thumping and showing this bad behavior to show that it's not afraid of the United States or the West, right? So in 2018, just to rewind just a bit, Donald Trump pulled out of the JCPOA, the nuclear deal that was struck between Iran's regime and the five Western powers, P5+1, in Obama's era, that being really the crown jewel of the Obama foreign policy. And then President Trump campaigned on pulling out of this deal. He did pull out of it. And ever since then, the Biden administration coming into office has tried to get back into a deal. Now, you would think, and I give this roundabout, connecting of the dots, because you would think that Iran's regime would be on its best behavior to get back into a deal, but it's just the opposite. We have seen them crack down on their own civilians at home, peaceful protesters being shot, killed, and put into prisons. We've seen them chemically attacking young students in schools. We've seen them poking, blinding them in the eye because they're peacefully protesting, killing them, shooting at them point blank on the streets. And then you have what they're doing in the region, putting billions of dollars into global terrorism, suicide bombings, organized terror groups like Hezbollah and Hamas and others, Palestinian Islamic Jihad. And then you look at the Biden administration and say, why are you trying to strike a deal with this regime that now is taking our oil tankers? We're not safe, not in the region, not at home. They're at our footstep in Latin America, just south of our border here. So there's a lot to connect. And I know this is a very roundabout answer, but to give you an aerial view of what the Iran regime has done and how the West is treating them, the Europeans and the United States alike, still wanting a courtship, still wanting to get closer to Iran's regime in order to strike a deal.
Now, closer to home for you, especially the California School District has approved 2 new curriculums, which accuses Israel of ethnic cleansing and war crimes. So, Lisa, you're right there in California. You must have some firsthand knowledge on this. What's going on exactly? How did this come to be?
This is mind-boggling, Jeanette. That's what it is. This is mind-boggling that any school system, that any place in the world would be so fixated on teaching young students about just propaganda against Israel, our ally. So you would think they would perhaps look to the White House and say, well, what is our positioning in terms of this country with Israel? Well, Israel is an ally. Israel has been an ally for decades. It's our only ally, the only democracy in the Middle East. So why would a school system be so fixated on teaching propaganda against our ally? Well, it can only mean one thing, and there are external influences. So it's either people on the school board, it's either individuals who are hell-bent on raising these issues, just like we have them in Congress. We have women that are elected into Congress that their entire being, their presence, their agenda, their reason for being in Congress is to spread anti-Israel propaganda. And here you have it in more, locally at a school, in a school system, where in Santa Ana they decided to teach this propaganda. Then you ask yourself, are they teaching propaganda against countries like Russia and China, North Korea, Iran's regime, countries that actually we do have issues with, that they are killing their own, that they do have human rights abuses records? Why aren't we teaching that? And why the fixation on a country like Israel? I mean, we have many, many more bad characters and actors on the map. And why aren't they going after them? It can only be one thing, and that, kind of traces us back to anti-Semitism and anti-Israel sentiments that, again, it's propaganda, and these individuals have to be rooted out. And, when you're starting with young children and kind of brainwashing them at such a young age when they don't have any sort of other influence or any sort of way of getting knowledge about these topics, it's a very serious issue.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, looking to your southern border there, Lisa, President Biden has authorized the military to call up reservists to combat drug trafficking at that southern border. So, Lisa, it seems he's declaring this a national emergency. So what is this executive order? What will it do exactly? And what does it mean?
Well, yeah, first, it means that the Biden administration is finally acknowledging that there is an issue at our southern border, something that Mayorkas and the Biden administration have been denying for such a long time. Secondly, it confirms what our Border Patrol agents have been telling us, that there is a crisis at the southern border and that they're not capable of handling it with the resources that they have been given. Thirdly, it also confirms the fact that it's been very difficult to hire for these positions at the southern border. Nobody wants that job. It's dangerous, it's thankless, and they're not getting anywhere because there is such a clash between Border Patrol and the Biden administration in terms of what the policy should be. So I've heard this firsthand from a lot of Border Patrol agents, people who are seeing this firsthand and complaining that they can't carry out their job because of the policies coming from Washington, D.C. And lastly, it puts reservists in a position to now have to step up and to help out, roll up their sleeves and help out with a major crisis. Look, nobody is against legal immigration. We want people to come to this country. We need them for many reasons. We want them to have an opportunity. I'm the daughter of immigrants to this country, and I couldn't be more proud of my parents for making the decision to come here and to give me all those opportunities. But they came here legally. And the reason I say that is because we have a major crisis here. People conflate these issues. First of all, if you think it's a humanitarian position you're taking, people have to swim, they drown, they get raped, they get killed, they're sick. And there's so many challenges that these individuals face in order to get here illegally because they give them these false hopes. They pay money to coyotes, they put themselves in harm's way, they put their children at risk as well. Once they get here, we have a major drug crisis at the border, exactly what the Biden administration is admitting. We're allowing all of that to come into this country unvetted. And there's no way to stop it because of the lack of control at the border. So if we were to say, listen, we want to protect our suburbs, we want to protect our teens from dying from fentanyl overdose, from dying from all these different drug overdoses, new things being introduced to our young children, our young teens, then we have to stop the issue at its root and not at the border itself.
Looks like we're about out of time here, but Lisa Daftari of the Foreign Desk, thanks so much for joining me today.
Of course. Thank you for having me, Jeanette.
Land might be the only thing in the world that we can't make more of, and as a result, stewardship of the land is something that's been happening since the beginning of time. So who better to steward the land here in Canada than those who work on the land every day as part of their farming and ranching activities? So to talk more about land stewardship in Alberta, we're bringing in Justin Thompson, the Executive Director of Southern Alberta Land Trust, or SALTS, as it's known. Justin, welcome to Bridge City News.
Thank you very much for having me.
Okay, absolutely. So Justin, for those who may not have heard of SALTS here in Alberta, can you maybe give us a brief overview of how your organization cares for the rural and wild lands of Alberta?
Sure. So SALTS is a land trust organization, and we're a bit unique because, as you mentioned, our organization was started by ranchers in southern Alberta, and our board of directors is still primarily made up of folks who ranch on a full-time basis. And so our focus is really to work with landowners to conserve those private lands in southern Alberta that are of high ecological value. So wildlife habitat, important watershed areas. And so we do that through a tool called a conservation easement, which has been used now for, I guess, about 25 years in Alberta. And it essentially, in partnership with the landowner, if the landowner wants to see their land conserved, the easement basically puts a set of restrictions on the land that limit certain types of development. So, subdivision, new roads, cultivation, for example, of native grasslands, but really continues to support and encourage land uses like ranching that keep the land intact and support those values like wildlife habitat, like healthy watersheds, and also help to essentially keep the land in agriculture.
Oh, wow. Okay, so you support them, but maybe can you talk about the relationship between Salts and the farmers and ranchers in Alberta?
Absolutely, yeah. So when we enter into a conservation easement, and the landowner decides they want to see their land protected, it's a long-term relationship. The land is protected in perpetuity, but we also work with the landowners. Our landowners typically are already very good stewards, so they're already really interested in maintaining things like range health, riparian health. But we also try to bring extra value to the landowner where we can bring dollars for off-stream watering, fencing projects that help manage the grassland and the habitat. And so we're working with them on an ongoing basis. A lot of these landowners already know how to steward the land really well, but of course the economics of ranching is challenging. And so we try and bring some support to the table to help them do the absolutely best job of stewarding those lands. The big thing we do, though, is the front end, where these important properties that could be converted to a non-agricultural use, like subdivision and development, roads, whatever it might be, the big step is to keep those lands from becoming more fragmented. And so in the case, for example, for Lethbridge specifically, Salts has done conservation projects with landowners covering about 35,000 acres in the Old Man watershed, which is about, I think, about 140 square kilometers of land, and that's all upstream of Lethbridge. And a lot of those projects are along rivers like the Old Man or the Crow's Nest, which means those lands are going to keep helping to provide services like clean water, flood mitigation, because when we convert these landscapes to things like houses and roads, of course, the water comes off more quickly, it comes off dirtier, and so we're really trying to maintain things like water quality upstream.
Yeah. Okay. So you gave me some numbers there with some areas around the Old Man watershed and near Lethbridge. Maybe can you give us an idea of the amount of land that's being conserved with Salts overall?
Yeah. So actually, because so much of Salt's work is from sort of west of Calgary down to Waterton Lakes National Park, most of our conservation easements are in the Old Man watershed. So again, about 35,000 acres of the land that we've protected is in the Old Man watershed. We've done probably another 10,000 acres outside. But really, that's why I'm excited to talk to you, is that so much of our work really is protecting lands that are of really high value for water and also recreation. If you like fishing, if you like hunting, we're protecting lands that are maintaining those resources, west of Lethbridge. If you start to look at what other land trusts, so there's Salts, there's organizations like Nature Conservancy, Ducks Unlimited, there's other regional land trusts. There's been hundreds of thousands of acres conserved in the Old Man watershed, upstream of Lethbridge. And that is going to be really valuable in the long term to maintaining things like water quality and quantity downstream for the irrigation districts too, right? If we can keep those lands intact so they're providing better water flow throughout seasons and those sorts of things. So a lot of work being done. And I think, we don't do a lot of communications to folks in cities, but a lot of the work that we're doing is really having a direct benefit for cities, even though we're working in these rural areas.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Okay, so how do you see the mission of Salts that impacts Albertans and I suppose visitors even to the province as well?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So, even though we're really focused on, how do you maintain healthy grasslands and riparian areas and watersheds, if you start to think of what that means, for example, we've protected a bunch of land along the Cowboy Trail, which means, that's one of the most beautiful highways in my mind anywhere in the world. And it's a real tourism draw. People go down that highway and they're like, isn't this amazing? This big open country, open spaces, no development. So by keeping that as open space, there's tourism value there. Land trusts like Salts have protected a huge amount of, for example, winter range for deer and elk and moose. So if you're interested as a hunter, we're helping to protect that resource. We've conserved kilometers of land on either sides of rivers, like the Castle, the Old Man, and the Crow's Nest. So if you like fishing, it's preserving those resources. So there's recreation, there's tourism, there's aesthetic resources that are all being conserved on private land that are benefiting Albertans really broadly.
Mm-hmm. Now, there's an education component to Salts. So maybe what can you tell us about it?
Yeah, I think our biggest effort on the education side is helping people to understand the value of these private lands in Alberta. I think a lot of people think, well, we have our parks, right? We've got our parks in the mountains, and so we've got it all done. But there's a lot of private land outside of parks that we rely on for things like freshwater and wildlife. And so that's our biggest push from an education standpoint, especially in talking to people that live in urban centers, to just help them understand just how valuable these landscapes are. And the other thing we like to help people understand is that, you know, ranching and grazing on our grasslands and foothills is probably the most compatible land use. You know, those landscapes evolved with grazing by bison, and they actually require grazing in order to maintain biodiversity and the health of the soil. And so a lot of people, I think, have concerns, but don't realize that, in fact, having ranching on those landscapes is probably the most compatible land use if you want to maintain things like water quality and wildlife habitat. So that's another big education piece here, is that, you know, if we remove grazing from that landscape in the foothills and the grasslands, it would actually have a negative effect on a lot of these things that we value.
Wow. So in your mind, Justin, it's important for landowners to participate in the mission of SALT, obviously. Are there risks, though, or downside? Is there a downside for landowners who participate with the land trust?
You know, we do not get involved in the day-to-day management of the land. So really, we're very hands-off. The landowner can continue to manage the land. The land can be transferred to their family. It can be sold. We have no say in that. It's if the landowner's values align with our values, then it's a really good fit. And another big factor here is that salts, when we do these conservation easements, can bring some really important financial incentives to the landowner, because the landowner is giving up some development rights when they do these easements. And so in return, we can compensate them for that. And we can do that often through a combination of a charitable receipt and some cash payment. And those charitable receipts can often be really helpful to ranchers and landowners who are dealing with the transfer of their land, for example, the next generation. So we can facilitate often the transfer of land between generations and help to avoid big capital gains tax that might otherwise mean they'd have to sell parts of the ranch during that transfer. So, you know, there's the conservation value if the landowners are aligned, and so if there's alignment there, no downsides. We're not involved in the management, and there's also this financial opportunity that can really help families if they're trying to make sure they can continue to ranch.
Interesting. Okay, so Justin, looking ahead a couple of decades, how big of a role does we were talking about Southern Alberta, Lethbridge, how big of a role does the Highway 2 corridor between Lethbridge and Calgary play in the future targets for land stewardship?
Yeah, that's a good question. So the Highway 2 corridor, has a really interesting mix. Certainly along the east side of the corridor, there's a lot of cultivated land, but there's also some pockets of really important grassland habitat. But west of Highway 2, all along the Porcupine Hills, that is actually to the west of Highway 2, on the east side of the Porcupine Hills, that is one of the biggest remaining blocks of grassland in southern Alberta. It's one of those places that has not been converted to other land uses. And so that's a really important area for us to try and see, both from a wildlife standpoint, but also from a watershed, right? Because so many of our creeks and rivers flow off those foothills. And so keeping those foothills intact is really key. And so really we're trying to make sure, land conservation will never protect all the land, and we can't, and we don't intend to, but we're really trying to focus in on those areas of the province that have the highest ecological value, but also going to benefit Albertans long-term down the road in terms of protecting our water and our wildlife resources and our tourism resources. So the Highway 2 corridor is really key. Like I said, west of Highway 2, there's some really, really important land. And then there's also some areas just east of Highway 2, there's pockets of grasslands that are really valuable habitat, especially along our rivers. If we can keep some of that land next to our rivers in sort of a more natural state, it's important. There's so much wildlife, of course, that we know that congregates along rivers. It helps the water quality in the river if there's natural landscapes on either side. There are wildlife corridors up and down rivers, so it's a very important area.
Are there any number of bears or other predatory animals? Are they increasing to your knowledge?
Yeah, I mean that's a really big, complex question. I mean, we have for a number of years we've seen a lot more, I think, predators on private lands. We've got a lot of black bears and grizzly bears and cougars in the foothills of Alberta, and they're also moving along those corridors, the river corridors. And so that's been something that ranchers are having to manage. I think there's been more and more effective tools on how we coexist with those predators. And there's been a lot of good work done on how we coexist with those predators because, in the past we would just get rid of them. But I think now we're moving towards a new relationship with a lot of those predators, and I think, for the most part, the ranching industry is trying to find a balance to coexist.
Oh, that's fantastic. And of course, here in the southwest corner of Alberta, something also that you see a lot is logging, oil, gas, and mining operations in the area. So do you see an increasing relationship between stewarding the land and resource use?
It's a good question. I mean, more of the proposals for logging and mining are happening on public lands. And of course, with salts, we're just working on private lands. Conservation easements, if there's existing oil and gas or there's mineral rights holders, conservation easements don't, stop the mineral rights holder necessarily. We try and work with the landowner. And if there's proposals for oil and gas, for example, we try and work with the landowner and the proponent to really minimize the impact to the property from an ecological standpoint. It's not a big part of what we're seeing. We're not seeing a lot of new mineral development like oil and gas, and certainly not forestry or mining on our properties that we work with landowners. It's not a huge factor. I think it is interesting though to talk about the interplay between the private land and the crown land next door, because we have these proposals sometimes on crown land, but then of course what happens to water and wildlife on crown land will affect the private land right downstream or right next door. And so where we're working to conserve private land up and down the foothills, we do want to make sure that's what's happening next door on the public land is making sure that both are complementing each other. So they're related, but we're not seeing that doesn't affect us directly.
Justin, it looks like we're about out of time, but thanks so much for joining us today. I appreciate having you on.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Justin Thompson is the Executive Director of the Southern Alberta Land Trust. I'm Jeanette Roche on behalf of all of us here at Bridge City News. Thanks for watching.